1 year after losing everything, David finally understood the most important lesson about money. But the strange part is this: the lesson didn't come from a book, or from a billionaire, or from years of experience. It came from a stranger sitting on a quiet park bench. Here we believe that wisdom doesn't always arrive with applause or grand victories. Sometimes it appears in the middle of an ordinary day, on a rainy street, in a quiet park, or in a conversation that changes the direction of your entire life. These are daily wisdom stories. And today's story begins with a man named David, standing in the rain outside a restaurant, holding the last paycheck he would ever receive. David only truly understood the most important lesson about money 1 year after a stranger in a park changed the direction of his life forever. At the time, however, he had no idea that the quiet woman sitting on a weathered wooden bench would become the definitive turning point between the man he was, a prisoner of tireless physical labor, and the man he was destined to become. The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall. It clings to you like a heavy, cold coat, whispering secrets of every failure you've ever tried to wash away. It is a relentless grey saturation that makes the concrete feel like a sponge and the air feel like lead. David stood outside the glass doors of the Silver Spoon, one of the city's most prestigious bistros, feeling the droplets seep into his chef whites, chilling him to the very marrow of his bones. In his hand was a sodden envelope, his final paycheck and a notice of termination after 15 years of loyal, invisible service. He looked at the paper, the ink starting to bleed like a dark bruise, and realized that a decade and a half of his life had been reduced to a single, wet piece of stationery. At 35, David was a man who lived by the clock and died by the prep list. He was a creature of habit, forged in the fires of professional kitchens. He was always the first to arrive when the city was still a ghost of grey and mist, and the last to scrub the heavy iron burners until they shone like mirrors. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble, and he never complained about the suffocating heat or the double shifts that made his legs throb with a dull, constant ache. He believed piously in the mythology of hard work, the ancient, unwritten idea that sweat was the only currency required for a stable life. He remembered his father's voice, a man of calloused hands and tired eyes, telling him that if he just kept his head down and worked harder than the man next to him, the world would eventually open its doors. But as David stood in the downpour, those doors weren't opening. They were being locked from the inside. Across the street, his younger colleague Julian pulled away in a brand-new sports car that roared like a declaration of victory David couldn't understand. The engine's growl seemed to mock the silence of David's own empty pockets. Julian treated the kitchen like a stage and the staff like an audience. He was the kind of person who spent his weekends at rooftop bars and his Mondays complaining about mountain-high debt. Yet he always had the best clothes and a smile that suggested life was a gift he hadn't finished unwrapping. David envied that smile. It was a smile of someone who expected the world to provide, while David's own expression was one of someone who expected the world to take. His own life felt like a slow, painful calculation of survival, a constant deliberation over whether he could afford better laundry detergent or if he had to settle for the cheap brand that left his uniforms looking tired, grey, and defeated. 15 years of honest, bone-breaking work had given him nothing but aching knees and a bank account that seemed to shrink every time he blinked. He felt like a ghost in his own life, a spectator to a prosperity that everyone else seemed to have invited to dinner except him. The walk toward the park was not a choice, but a reflex. He needed to escape the smell of burnt garlic and the sight of the station where he had spent 5,000 nights of his life. The park was a cathedral of dying colors. The autumn leaves were a riot of gold and burnt orange, glowing with a defiant warmth against the grey concrete of his reality. He walked slowly, his boots squelching in the mud, feeling the weight of the sodden envelope in his pocket like a stone. Every person he passed seemed to be moving with a destination, a purpose. a future. David felt untethered, a ship whose anchor had snapped in the middle of a storm. He reached the ancient oak tree, a silent witness to a century of human grief and joy, and saw her. She sat there with a stillness that was almost unnatural in a world that never stopped moving. She wore a cream-colored coat and a silk scarf that moved softly with the wind, like a flag of truce. She wasn't a billionaire in the way the movies showed them. She was something more powerful. She was a woman who possessed the one thing David had never known: true, unshakable peace. The woman watched the squirrel with a focus that made the creature's frantic struggle feel like a cosmic performance, a silent drama of instinct and effort played out on a stage of wet gravel. "Notice how he doesn't just run," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the sea of David's internal chaos. "He stops to look at the horizon before he digs. He is calculating the risk of being seen against the reward of being fed. Most men, David, simply dig until their claws bleed, never realizing they are being watched by the very hawks they fear because their heads are too low to the ground." David looked at the squirrel, then at the sodden envelope in his hand, feeling the weight of 15 years of blind digging in the dark corners of kitchens. "At least he knows he'll eat this winter," David muttered, the bitterness of his termination still a jagged glass shard in his throat that made every word feel like a small cut. The woman turned slightly, her sharp blue eyes catching a stray beam of light that managed to pierce the heavy Seattle mist, making her look like a figure carved from marble and wisdom. "Yes," she said with a slow, deliberate nod that felt like a sentence being passed. "But notice something more important. It buries many acorns, but it also remembers exactly where they are. Hard work alone is not survival, David. Hard work without a map is just a slow form of suicide. Memory and strategy are the true currencies of the living. Without a map in your mind, you are just an exhausted laborer digging holes in the dark, hoping to stumble upon a treasure you didn't even plant." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. It was the cold realization that he had spent his entire adult life planting seeds in other people's gardens, without ever marking the spot for himself. David sat down on the far edge of the bench, the old wood groaning, as if in sympathy with his tired frame, which felt as though it were made of lead and broken promises. Without planning to, he began to peel back the layers of his frustration, telling her about the missed holidays, the birthdays spent over a roaring stove while his family grew old without him, and the bank account that seemed to have a leak he couldn't find, no matter how much he earned. He spoke of Julian, the colleague who appeared to move through life with a golden ticket, while David felt he was always paying for a seat he never got to sit in. The woman listened with a stillness that was both a comfort and a challenge, her gaze never leaving the spot where the squirrel had finally found its mark in the soft earth. "You are looking at the harvest," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of a hidden empire. "But you have never once studied the soil. You believe that because you worked hard, the world owes you a garden. But the world is a cold creditor, David. It only cares about the quality of the fruit you bring to the market." She pointed subtly across the street to a small, struggling cafe, where the neon lights flickered with an uncertain, dying energy. "And the owner there buys the cheapest coffee beans in the city to save a few pennies per cup, thinking he is being clever. But every year he loses hundreds of customers who never return because the experience is hollow. He is obsessed with the price of the seed and completely blind to the value of the tree. Many people, David, do the exact same thing with their own lives. They hoard pennies of effort while their souls go bankrupt from a total lack of vision. Wealth," she continued, "is not a destination or a number on a glowing screen, but a set of rigid boundaries that protect the person you are becoming." She asked him who the first person he paid was when his check arrived, and as David listed the landlord, the electric company, and the grocer, she shook her head with a profound, quiet sadness that made him feel like a child failing a simple test. "So everyone else is paid for the privilege of your existence except for you. You work like a slave to ensure the profit of the utility company and the landlord's retirement, but the David account remains at zero. You are a king who gives all his gold to his servants and then wonders why his own treasury is empty. You have spent 15 years practicing the glory of sacrifice, believing that your suffering is a down payment on a future that was never actually for sale. But a tired mind is a blind mind, David. It cannot recognize opportunity even when it knocks so loud the neighbors start to complain. David felt the strange sensation of a veil being lifted, a terrifying clarity that made the grey park seem to glow with a predatory intelligence he had never noticed before. He had been a perfect laborer, a master of the prep list, but a terrible architect of his own destiny. The woman adjusted her silk scarf, the fabric catching the light like a memory of better days, and she told him that the currency of connection was what Julian possessed. The ability to be in the rooms where decisions are made while David was hiding in the shadows of the prep station. Your colleague buys a car to sit at tables where lives are changed, she whispered, her voice like a cool breeze over a burn, while you save your money to sit alone and worry about a tomorrow that looks exactly like today. One of you is investing in a future, and the other is just trying to survive the night. Let your hands be so busy that your soul has no time to grow. The months that followed that encounter in the park were not marked by a sudden stroke of luck or a winning lottery ticket. Instead, they were defined by a grinding internal war against 15 years of conditioned poverty. David sat in his small apartment, the peeling wallpaper a constant reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind, staring at a rejection email from a high-end bistro that claimed he was overqualified, but meant he was too expensive for their margins. For a moment, the weight of the old David returned, the one who wanted to hang his head and accept any minimum wage line cook position just to keep the lights on. But then he remembered the squirrel. He remembered the strategy behind the effort. He realized that for a decade and a half he had been a master of the how, but a novice of the why. The next morning he performed his first act of silent rebellion. He took $10 from his meager unemployment check and placed it in a small glass jar on his kitchen counter. It felt absurd, even irresponsible, while his rent was due in 3 days. But it was the first time in his life he had paid David before he paid the world. That $10 bill was more than currency. It was a psychological border, a declaration that his future was a creditor that demanded satisfaction before the landlord could even knock. This tiny act changed the chemistry of his ambition, turning a passive victim of circumstance into an active architect of value. He began to spend his days not just looking for a job, but studying the very industry that had discarded him. He spent hours in public libraries, reading books on negotiation, supply chain management, and the psychology of hospitality, subjects he had previously dismissed as management's problem. He realized that Julian's sports car wasn't just a sign of vanity, but a tool of proximity. Julian was paying for access to conversations David didn't even know were happening. So David started to manufacture his own proximity. He used his last decent suit to visit the local farmers' markets, not as a buyer, but as a student. He spoke to the suppliers he had known for years, asking them about their pain points, their delivery struggles, and their wasted margins. He stopped being a man who just knew how to sear a scallop. He became a man who understood why the scallop cost $4 more this week and how to fix the broken logistics behind it. The glory of sacrifice was the hardest anchor to cut, a heavy chain of pride that made him feel guilty for not being exhausted at the end of the day. He had to learn that a clear mind was more valuable than a tired body, and that staring at a spreadsheet for 2 hours could yield more wealth than 12 hours on a prep line. He began to see his time as a limited resource, a soil that needed to be nurtured rather than just depleted. He reached out to a former colleague who was struggling to open a small catering business, not asking for a job, but offering a solution. David spent 3 days redesigning their kitchen layout and renegotiating their contracts with poultry farmers, using the currency of connection he had once envied in others. He didn't ask for a salary, he asked for a percentage of the savings he generated. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, a move that the old David would have seen as a gamble, but the new David saw as an investment in the soil of value. By the 6-month mark, the glass jar on the counter was no longer just holding $10 bills. It was a symbol of a man who had reclaimed his treasury. He had learned that the world didn't pay for his sweat, and it certainly didn't care about his suffering. The world paid for the relief of its own headaches. David had transformed himself from a laborer who provided labor into a consultant who provided peace of mind. He was no longer competing with the Julians of the world for a spot on the line. He was creating the lines that men like Julian would eventually work on. He realized that the woman on the bench hadn't given him money because money was the byproduct, not the source. She had given him the map, and for the first time in his 35 years, David was no longer digging a hole in the dark. He was building a tower, one carefully placed stone at a time. Never again would his hands be so busy that his soul had no time to grow, for he had finally learned that true wealth is the freedom to decide which seeds deserve your sweat. The second autumn arrived not as a threat of cold, but as a golden celebration of a harvest David had finally planted for himself. He stood once more in the center of the city park, but the man who occupied his skin was a stranger to the broken chef who had stood there a year prior. David's coat was no longer a heavy, sodden burden of failure. It was a well-tailored shield of confidence, and his boots no longer squelched in the mud of indecision. Over the past 12 months, the small glass jar of $10 bills had evolved into a diversified portfolio of consulting contracts and a stake in a burgeoning logistics firm that specialized in farm-to-table efficiency. He had stopped selling his hours for survival and started licensing his wisdom for freedom. As he walked toward the ancient oak tree, he realized that the currency of connection he once envied in Julian had become his own natural language. He was no longer the ghost in the kitchen. He was the architect of the systems that fed the city. He had spent the year solving problems that others were too busy sweating to notice, and the world had paid him handsomely for the person he had become while doing so. The park was exactly as he remembered, a cathedral of gold, orange, and deep crimson. Yet everything had changed because his eyes were no longer focused on the dirt at his feet. He reached the weathered wooden bench, the spot where his old life ended and his new one began, and he felt a sudden, sharp pang of hope. He scanned the area for a cream-colored wool coat or a silk scarf dancing in the wind, half expecting the mysterious woman to be waiting there to collect a dividend on the wisdom she had lent him. But the bench was occupied only by a few fallen leaves and the ghost of a memory. David sat down in the exact spot where he had poured out his heart, feeling the cool wood beneath him. For a long time he simply watched a new generation of squirrels frantically burying their treasures, and he smiled a knowing, quiet smile. He realized then that he no longer needed her to be there physically, for her voice had been successfully transplanted into the very marrow of his thoughts. He was no longer a king with an empty treasury. He was a master of his own soil. As the sun began to dip below the Seattle skyline, casting long, purple shadows across the gravel path, David looked down at his hands. They were still the hands of a worker, strong, capable, and marked by the permanent history of his labor, but they were steady. The tremors of financial anxiety that had haunted his nights for 15 years had vanished, replaced by the calm weight of a man who knows his own value. He understood now that Julian's sports car was never the goal. It was just a symptom of a different perspective, one that David had finally surpassed by building a foundation of substance rather than just a facade of success. He had learned that the glory of sacrifice was a trap designed to keep men too tired to dream, and he had vowed never to let his schedule be so crowded that his soul lacked the oxygen to expand. He was a consultant, a strategist, and an investor, but above all, He was a man who had reclaimed the right to his own time. Before standing up to leave, David adjusted his scarf, a fine silk piece that reminded him of hers, and whispered a silent thank you to the empty air. He remembered the final words she had spoken as she walked away into the mist that first day, words that had become the compass for every decision he made. "The world doesn't pay you for your sweat, David," she had said with that piercing, intelligent blue gaze. "It pays you for the problems you solve and for the person you become while solving them." He walked out of the park, not as a man returning to a job, but as a man returning to a legacy. He finally knew that true wealth was the ability to watch the rain fall and see it not as a cold coat of failure, but as the very thing that makes the next harvest possible. Never again would his hands be so busy that his soul had no time to grow, for David had finally learned how to be the master of the seed and the king of the soil.